So, welcome to another edition of the Data Standard podcast experience. My name is Matt Rawl. I'm your host today, and I'm really happy to welcome Derek Doel. Derek is a principal data scientist. He's with a company called Analytics Odyssey. And Derek, thank you so much for joining the program today.
Thanks for having me, Matt.
Fantastic. So, just to kind of kick off the discussion, Derek, can you give a little bit of a background on yourself and kind of your career and what's led you at this point to Analytics Odyssey?
Yeah, let's see. So I have a master's in econometrics from the University of Utah and a bachelor's in actuarial science from Southern Utah University. I would say when I was 12, I wanted to be an actuary. That's kind of been my career goal. In college, it took exactly 4 years and not a single extra credit for me to get my degree. I hit everything in stride and then went right for my master's after that and just loved mathematics. That was really my focus, was just math, just raw math and then statistics. I met a manager of compliance analytics for American Express while I was doing my master's, and he was impressed with more or less my presentation skills and brought me on doing statistics and analysis for American Express. I ate it up from there. After a couple of years, I transitioned into performance analytics for their marketing organization. There was a team of 4 of us kind of really on the ground floor, that type of space. We were doing trigger campaigns and measuring ROI for multi-stage triggers with holdout campaigns. And the team of 4, we implemented Tableau probably in 2011, back when it was brand new. For American Express. And then our manager then, he's now the VP of data science at Divvy, who's a big startup here in the Utah, the Silicon Slopes area. One of my coworkers, he went on to be the head of data literacy for Click, and another the head of product development for Big Squid. So Click being a BI tool and Big Squid being an automated machine learning tool.
Sure.
So we all actually left. They moved the performance analytics back to New York, and we all dissipated right around the same time. And I joined a tech company, a startup. I was the 10th employee, and we had no funding, just a vision to do event management for enterprise events. So things like Salesforce, Dreamforce, where you have 100,000 people showing up. The idea was to do event analytics to show the attendee journey through the data that was captured before, during, and after the event. And I was the 10th employee, but the first in data. So came in, we had a white labeled BI tool called Yellowfin, and we migrated that to a white labeled BI tool called Burst. Grew our team to 10. I grew my team to about 10 BI analysts and project manager and developers to service customers. And then we blew up from there. We got Series B funding. We grew to 200 people in 3 years from the time I joined, got a whole new building and everything. And I transitioned actually into the product development space. We started a product team. They self-labeled themselves Datatron. You can imagine just a bunch of nerds just run around. Datatron. One of them was a woodworker and whittled out of wood our logo. So, and we were working on a theme song by the time I left, but it was great. We really developed the automated SQL system to drag and drop fields onto a report, like self-serve reporting, and to auto aggregate based off of metrics that they weren't aware would kind of duplicate the data. And then we developed core reports that sat on top of the configuration of our data. So what that looked like was 80 out of the box reports that showed, okay, here's the attendees that have registered for the event. Here's all the sessions that you have going on at the event. Here's, all the session participants at the event. Here's the number of, and here's a performance dashboard, the whole works. And so we delivered that, and I have since left RainFocus. I started with a company called Womply. At the same time, started my own consulting company. So consulting for Womply. And they my first day at Womply was March 15th of last year, which was the day COVID hit. I left a job on a Friday after doing my 2 weeks notice and went into a job not knowing if it was going to exist on a Monday. There was such a collapse during that time period. And we had to get scrappy during that. There was layoffs, there was budget cuts. We pivoted into the lending space to offer PPP funding to help connect small business owners.
Yep.
And we immediately we had unicorn status.
I was going to say Womply had some sort of incredible story, right? Out of that PPP. Okay.
Yes. And I was on the forefront of that, like a team of data scientists up at 3 a.m. figuring out how we're going to validate tax documents to be able to send across to lenders, like just getting an objective on the fly and then saying, okay, we've got thousands of people submitting applications. We've got to figure this out. And we were able to roll with it. I think the key was the data architecture that we kind of stubbed out in the beginning. But that's kind of my time there. And with Analytics Odyssey, it was with Womply just stepping back and saying, I really want to pursue data as a product. The whole strategy of being able to transform data, see it in a staging area, push it out into production, have a visualization tool sitting right on top of that, and then being able to actually loop through the data structure to build out the dashboards automatically, and then to take that one step further into like the predictive and machine learning space to say, okay, we have a data architecture that's sound, we have reports and dashboards that's sitting on top of that, and then we have a clear line for forecasting on core metrics across time, and then predicting things like product recommendations based off of other products' performance, those kind of things just out of the box. So that's a lot of kind of my journey to get here through that career space, if you will.
So, wow. I mean, first of all, congratulations on all your success. I mean, you sounds like you're kind of one of those guys that times it just right and comes in and there's lots of growth. I'd love to hear a little bit more about, you talked about kind of the data architecture was in place or was positioned correctly. So since you've done this a few times, what do you look for as you're kind of starting to look at either a company that you're thinking about joining, or when you're just evaluating companies? Like when you say data architecture is in place or they've got the proper approach, what does that mean for you? What does that look like?
Yeah, that's actually a good question. I don't think a lot of people really understand that until they come across bad architecture. So most applications these days follow what's called a third normal form data architecture. And that helps them publish those via APIs and make quick read and updates on the system, right? So what that third normal form usually looks like is everything has some form of a primary key. And then if the entity exists on a table that's not on the primary key table, that it has a foreign key referencing it, right? Let's stick with someone's email, for example.
Okay.
It's typical that an application will have a users table, and that users table will be keyed with a user ID. And then on that table, you would have a first name, a last name, and an email. And then typically, if that user is going to take any type of behavioral event within the product, the application, there will be a second table there will actually be two more tables. There will be one table that describes the dimension of the event. Mm-hmm. So think of in the event management space that they had sessions. So it was, you had a session ID, 1 row per session. And then you had the interaction between the two, right? You had a user and you had a session. And then when you have the two together, you would have sessions and users, and that would represent a session ID, a user ID, and then you would know that user went to that session. And you see that same type of relationship in really every application that you have. It's like, okay, you have a single dimensional table to describe one entity, like people, and then another dimensional table to describe another entity like products. And then you would have the third table that would describe the interaction between the two, right? And if you're in just like a data visualization space and you think, well, the easiest thing to do is to take that most granular table, let's say it's that users and sessions. So you've got one row per session and user. So if the user goes to 6 sessions, that's 6 rows of data in that table.
Yep.
And if you want to know the session type and you're just in the data visualization space, it might be best to transform and pull the session type from the sessions table and put it on your session user links table. However, if you get down the road 3 months and you decide to change your session type, you're probably left with some sticky code that transforms and calls and makes a hard reference to that session type. And you're left with just a lot of extra development on things, redundancy, and then things that are breaking because you weren't aware of it.
Yep.
And really the architecture, if you take the right time to put it in place, you just sit there and you say, okay, well, I'm making a transformation, but what sits on the outside of that, the result of the transformation still needs to carry your thought process of here's my unique key for this table, and I may do 6 different transformations to get from table 1 to table 2, but I still will end up with some unique and foreign key type relationship that will need to join together at the final result, not one table like a normalized table. It's more thinking in terms of like your keys, your primary keys.
Got it. Okay.
And then
go ahead.
Yeah. I was going to say there's a tool out there called DBT. Have you heard of it? The
DBT.
database. It's the database tool. So version control is a real thing in product development. If you can't hang with version control, then you're probably not a product. You're probably doing some type of service, right?
Mm-hmm.
And when you treat data as a product and you realize that data itself can be version controlled, much like every other application, then there's a tool called DBT, but there's lots of tools out there that really help you think about like your SQL transformations and putting that up into a version control system. So when you're making a change to a join, you're relabeling a column, you're doing a secondary step, the pull request into version control compares the differences of the SQL change that you make, and the tool itself runs the code as if it was in development mode. So your data warehouse has a staging version of what the data will look like, and you can review that staging version before you ever push to production. So if you have an application that's being powered by data, if you've got something further downstream like forecasts, you can test it on your staging data before you deploy, and it includes unit tests. So you can say, hey, one of the biggest things we see is like, companies describe their data in core metrics and core dimensions, like, number of users, revenue, lifetime value, those types of things. Well, if you're reporting those numbers on 2 separate tables, the total of that value should match 1-to-1, right? If I've got revenue as a metric, and then I say, here's my revenue broken down by product, the 2 in total should definitely match.
Better add up, right?
And that's in version control and deployment strategy. You should consider that. You should say, hey, this is a test that this is a no-brainer thing that should be passed. I'm going to write it as a little SQL thing, and I'm going to put it into my version control. And every time I make a change, I want this test to run, and you can run, it doesn't take that many. It's like 20 or 30 tests to run your whole, you might have 80 tables and a ton of different transformations, but 20 or 30 tests to say, hey, I know that these are my core places that my executives are referencing, and I just need to make sure the numbers are right. So.
Got it. I want to jump in. I want to change the subject just a little bit because I want to talk about, you've got a lot of experience in machine learning. And that's a big area of interest, obviously, for the folks that are listening to this podcast. Can you talk a little bit about kind of some of the modeling techniques that you're using, and also maybe just the evolution, right? I mean, you wanted to be an actuary, then you were in analytics with American Express. Like, how did you make that kind of journey yourself over to doing kind of advanced machine learning kind of, techniques and implementing that into your business today?
Yeah, that's a good question. There's a very real segmented areas of data and what it can do, right? And there's lots of entry points in the career field of what you do with that data. But usually like it's lined up in terms of like API and raw data layer, where you're kind of in the engineering space, transferring back and forth like API calls or storing, data engineering, storing massive loads of data. So you've got kind of like that raw descriptive level. You've got your visualization level, which is like a lot of SQL, a lot of transformations. You're probably dealing with data warehouses by the time you're to there. And then you've got your next one, like that predictive level, and then like the prescriptive level. And keeping an eye to that and knowing that is what data utilization is. Like when it comes down to it, you're going to want to see the data, you're going to want to have the data, and you're going to want to use the data for something, right? And you're not going to want to use it in the past. You're going to want to use it for future events. My journey started with American Express. I didn't even know SQL. I barely knew Microsoft Access and databases. So learning from there and learning how to just make case statements and transformations really is what kind of got me that next step to get into more of like a workflow management tool. Back the day, it was the big tool was called SAS, SAS.
Sure, that's what I learned.
What?
They're still a big company, right?
They're still a big company, yeah, but kind of unheard of these days in such a, unless you're a big, massive enterprise that can afford giant licensing platform fees, you're probably going to go with a kind of hybrid approach of finding smaller things that meet your needs, right?
Yep.
And so since I've left American Express, I haven't seen or heard anybody that uses SAS, unless it's like in that financial enterprise space. So, but in there, I was doing a lot of just, you could control a lot more the tests that you wanted to run. We were doing bootstrapping for marketing campaigns to kind of show differences of performance and control holdouts and measuring that. But it wasn't really until I transitioned into the product development space and worked with the development team that I really started to say, okay, machine learning, there's a way to do it right? Like every time you got to think about your pipelines, your automated pipelines. You've got to think about at each point in machine learning, there is a specialization that probably someone has, and there's a tool, probably open source, that helps with that specialization, right? Yep. So I got really good at researching tools to do certain problems and kind of identifying, what are the tools, what's their product release schedule look like? Is this something that I'm going to get into and hate in 2 years because it hasn't changed? How new am I going to be on the front level of paying for them being on a new product? So, and am I willing to do that for the price? Maybe, or is this something that's critical that we're going to invest money in? When I was at Womply, our first kind of thing, the low level, is we were doing everything in AWS. So when it came time to think about like, hey, what's the next level? It was easy to prototype things in SageMaker and say, hey, it's got a lot of the pipeline power that you're going to need, but it's got there, as long as you're willing to pay for usage, like let it do its thing. It'll be nice. It's trying to be the one tool that cures it all. We've since said, hey, this isn't the one tool that's going to cure it all, but it's definitely a tool that you can prototype quickly and deploy up and have an API endpoint that sits there and serves up those predictions. But I think for me, learning machine learning has really been being aware of the use cases when they arise and having the research and development mindset say, what has been done out there in the space for this use case? What is my current architecture and technologies that I have today? And then fitting the right tool or the right, like your experience to the problem, I guess. Yeah. I don't think it's as much about going out in machine learning and saying, I'm going to do machine learning. What are all the things that I can do machine learning for? It's like, it's really taking whatever it is that's the needs of the business, like setting that focus and then saying, okay, well, how does machine learning like contribute to this objective? In which way would machine learning fix this? Is it through a recommendation? Like, can we get on the user, like right at user level, run a machine that runs a recommendation? If that's the case, what's the process to get that to the organization, right? Like, how do we How do we architect that? How do we even budget time to architect it? How do we get buy-off from the executive team to go forward with that? And that's like things that you have to see a couple months in advance before it's needed, because those things take a ton of time. If you're kind of waiting too long, you're never going to get there.
So
pitching that idea too hard.
I love your description, because I you've got kind of those three levels you talked about, right? So that kind of engineering the data, the API calls, moving data back and forth. You've got that next level, which is visualization, and then you've got kind of that machine learning that you described. It seems like from what I'm hearing, and we talk to a lot of data scientists, there's a lot more. It seems like the business is starting to hear about the buzzword of machine learning, and they're excited about it, and they want in, right? And so there's pressure. We need to do machine learning. On the actual, most of the enterprises that I interact with, though, the actual amount of machine learning that's happening inside of their business is relatively, and this is a general statement, it's not every company, but it's relatively, I would say, elementary. It's more, linear regression. It's more basic statistics than it is really machine learning. Curious to hear your perspective on that, and like how you kind of see that changing over the next couple of years.
Yeah, well, it's all magic tricks, right? Like that's what data. Nobody knows what's beneath the curtain when it's data, and so you see it, and they call it a recommendation, and you think it is. And you don't know, it's just a report that's running every night and sorting from top to bottom and just giving you the top result, right? And maybe it's not even that. Like maybe it's just like literally someone hard coded something to say, hey, give me the number of times this person's logged in, or something like that. It's never going to change. I think it's so like everything's open source these days, or everything's got a niche that you can't not break into machine learning, but you do find that those that just want machine learning are not implementing it right. And then there's a lot of companies that are calling it machine learning, and it's just like reporting, which isn't a problem. Like maybe you have a ton of good reports that are powering your business, that in and of itself is a machine, and if you've got to stuff more people into your organization for that machine to learn, then that's your machine learning like journey, right? Yep. I honestly, have you heard of Elasticsearch?
Yes. Yep.
It's an amazing tool for machine learning purposes that I don't think people give it credit for. Okay. I think in a lot of ways, thinking about matching and saying, hey, we need to match, right? We need to find the most similar thing to whatever state we're in, we want the most similar.
Yep.
Well, Elasticsearch, that's all it is. It's just a search query. So if you're trying to dedupe people, and you think, how do we dedupe on first name, last name? Well, Elasticsearch is a good tool for that. Or, really running through and uploading a database and then just writing a query to that tool. And then linear regression on top of that is actually pretty powerful. Yep. But then I think having a system to say, hey, we're going to release that as our latest version, and it's V1. And then having that mindset of, we're going to release another version in the future, and it's going to be called V1.1. Well, that architecture is pretty complex if you don't think about it ahead of time, and you don't take the time right on the first model to say, hey, we're implementing machine learning. The way that we're going to do it is through versioning, through releasing a model version, having, all the metadata that produce that model, being able to version that model, being able to produce a new model and test that version versus the newer version. Like those are all things that I think you need to build outwards. And a lot of people just don't have that kind of experience.
Got it. Okay. So I know we're running kind of short on time. I'm just curious, Derek, Analytics Odyssey, can you give us 1 or 2 minutes on what you're doing and kind of the business model there, and just so that folks know kind of, what you're working on right now?
Yeah. So really it's data warehousing and beyond. So we'll get into business, meet with the executive level to find what their core performance objectives are for the next, X amount of time, and then start to discuss sources, bring those sources into our data warehouse, link that all into some Snowflake or star schema model, and then hook that up into a visualization tool that we have. And once we define the core metrics and core dimensions, the visualizations build themselves. And then we have just the feedback loop for our end users to self-serve their analytics. Our motto is data you can do. And the thought is that data is finite in the architecture that it presents, and that we can do better as a data organization or data people to make it more end user friendly for everybody to be able to do data, right? I think that's what I've seen in the space is there's an app for everything. Everything is, solves a niche thing. It's just a matter of now partnerships across the board to create apps that are super well user-friendly for the data world and, puts that power into the hands of the business owner.
And your target are SMB or enterprise, or who are you kind of going after?
A lot of e-commerce,
okay.
But more in the 10 million and above, in annual revenue. We find the more data, the better. So if it's, up to 1 billion rows a day, we'll load that in, transform it, and push it out. So.
Got it. Well, Derek Doel, principal data scientist, Analytics Odyssey. I could talk to you for a lot longer than this, but I know you've got other things to do. Thank you for your time. Thank you on behalf of the Data Standard. And if folks want to reach out and connect with you, best way is on LinkedIn, or what's your preference?
LinkedIn's great. Yeah, hit me up. I'd love to talk to you.
Fantastic. Thanks again, Derek.
Thanks, man.